Welcome to the Security Accelerator podcast powered by Symbian, where each week we will discuss the latest innovations and emerging trends in generative AI for cyber defense. I am your host, Jason Kierstead. Today on the Security Accelerator podcast, I am speaking with Augusto Barros, who is currently the Vice President of Product Marketing at Securonics. Augusto has a long and distinguished career in security, specializing in SIEM technologies. Here is my conversation with Augusto. Hi, Augusto. Thanks for joining me today on the Security Accelerator podcast.
Thank you, Jason. It's really a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Let's kick off this conversation with a basic question. When we all talk about AI in the SIEM, that can mean a lot of different things to different people depending on their background. So what do you think are the areas of SIEM that LLMs are going to impact and why?
Right. One thing that I like from your question is that you started talking about AI, and then when you phrased the question, you asked about LLM specifically. And I think that's probably the first thing that I like to highlight when we talk about SIEM and AI. Right? We've been using AI techniques for a long time, right? And especially around the unsupervised learning. When you look into anomaly detection, for example, right? There have been use cases for that in SIEM and UBA. And at this time, I consider SIEM UBA the same thing, right? These markets have converged a long time ago. But we've been using AI on that sense for a long time, and it has a very strong role in detection. Right? We know that there are many cases. If you think, for example, on those cases where you have a lot of data being sent right to outside the organization, and you want to find an anomaly, every time that you try to do that with a brittle rule, right, you end up having to fix thresholds, and that's a nightmare, right? From the point of false positives or even false negatives, and the dynamic ability that you have to do that with unsupervised learning really help us implement those use cases properly, right? For data transfers, for anomalies in authentication, etc. But when we look into the new crop of AI technologies, right, LLM specifically, as you said, I think it's a whole different ballgame, because I don't think that at this point, these technologies will help us much from the detection point of view, right? Especially when you look into how opaque sometimes the outcome of the use of these technologies is, right? Why is it telling me this or that? The risk of hallucinations, so it ends up being hard for us to determine the false positive and false negative rates, for example. I think it limits a bit how these technologies can be used from a detection point of view. However, we always had a problem with SIEM of generating too much signal, right? Too many alerts and too many things. And then we have the problem of having enough manpower to investigate all those. And I think that on that side of the equation, I think LLMs can really help us, especially when we start looking at agentic AI. I think we can talk more about that later. But that's where I think that we can deliver those results that we normally put in the hands of humans. And then there's so much findings that you have to put layers of L1, L2 analysts, etc., right, to handle that. I think if you leave those findings in the hands of the LLM-based technology, it can really save us a lot of time and making products like a SIEM, right, more efficient, because these early stages of investigation and triage of the findings can be done by the technology.
So as you mentioned, SIEMs have been doing AI for a long time, and I've always struggled, by the way, with this trying to figure out what to call machine learning / AI before LLMs, because like you mentioned, it gets confused. I tend to call it classical machine learning, even though it's very fuzzy. But like you say, people get confused a lot when we talk about AI, and we've been doing AI in SIEM for like 10, 15, 20 years. Do you think that are there any use cases that, let's say, classical machine learning is doing that you think LLMs will take over from, or is it going to be a completely new space, as you mentioned?
Well, the problem with the traditional machine learning, right, or the classic machine learning, as you're describing, is it requires a lot of structure, right? And even when you look into deep learning, where you don't need as much structure as the normal or the more traditional use cases, you need to normalize data. You need to put a lot of effort into feature engineering sometimes in order to apply it. Right? And with the new AI technologies, with LLM, that becomes less of a need, right? And it seems that can we see some emerging capabilities into those models of understanding things with less structure that could really be beneficial for kind of to bridge the gap in those cases where we don't have as much structure as kind of we would wish to have, again, to apply the more traditional machine learning. So I see these technologies being able to add value before and after you apply the classic machine learning, right? So you can put it before, so you can get the more unstructured data and put it in the format where the more traditional algorithms will be helpful. And you can also use that later, as I mentioned, right? Kind of when we add that technology on the triage side, right, to look into the output from the machine learning algorithms and to not only to do the triage, but also to explain better to the humans what was found. Right? Many times we see a lot of effort, especially on the user experience side, trying to okay how we can better represent the information that is coming out from these machine learning algorithms so people can understand why we are flagging something as suspicious or even as malicious directly. And I think that putting kind of a layer of LLM based technology on top of that can translate those findings in a way that a human will find easier to understand.
So, what one of the use cases that folks continuously bring up to me, it seems like it comes up every 3 to 4 weeks, is this idea that LLMs can be used to automate data ingestion and automatically create parsers and solve for world hunger. And my experience is that tells me that this is probably going to be a lot harder than some folks who aren't in deep in sim realize. What's your take on this? Do you think that LLMs can solve for one of these major sim pain points around data ingestion?
Yeah, one thing kind of that I get from the question is kind of will it solve the problem? And I think, and every time that we go with this
Mm,
word, right, we solve, I think that's kind of where kind of the answer will be depends, right? If say will we completely solve in a way that we can completely hide it from humans? No, I don't think so, right? Especially because when you're starting to look at data sources and trying to figure out what type of data you want, right? How do you want to normalize it? Which fields are more related to others, right? Kind of from other data sources, etc. Sometimes it may require cognitive abilities that the models still do
yes.
not have, right? Especially if there's no information about that data source, right? Because they can, of course, kind of ingest huge amounts of information. They may end up seeing the documentation about those data sources, and then it's going to be straightforward. It's just right, kind of going through the documentation and mapping one field to the other, and that's it. But what if you have this data source that you do not know what it is? You don't know what each field is. And then you need to apply a certain level of cognitive, right, kind of thinking to look at those fields and realize what it is, right? Because sometimes something what that may be easily described as a authentication event may not be that clear from that log, right? So you need to understand, okay, in which conditions these events are being generated, what triggered that, and then interpret that in a way that kind of points you towards the right answer. And I don't think the models have the ability to do that yet. So I think kind of when you have more straightforward and maybe more labor intensive type of work, they will really simplify tremendously, right? Okay, I have the documentation for the data source, or the logs are verbose enough that you can quickly understand what each field is. I think the models can do a great job in writing a parser for that. But when we have the more cryptic logs, they would need to understand what the application does. Right? Let me see what the user is doing on the application side so I can understand on the other side what is coming out of each log entry so I can figure out like, what this log really represents. I think that's where the human's still going to be necessary. Right? So I think that the question, will it solve the problem? No. Will it make it easier? Definitely.
Yes. Yeah, I'd agree 100%. Um, let's talk a little bit about AI agents. You mentioned them previously. Having agents that could help you automate complex tasks in the sim would be really fantastic. But what are some challenges that customers might run into if they're trying to deploy AI agents in the sim?
I think that we are in a point where the agents are starting to be used in multiple cases, and they show kind of pretty nice results, right? And I think kind of when you look at organizations that are struggling with the operational side of SIM, right? Kind of having kind of enough people to go over the results and define if things are malicious or not. Look at all the suspicious cases and looking at the content, right? And define, for example, what new content you need for the SIM. It is really kind of a set of problems that you can alleviate with the agents, especially when you look at triage of events, right? Of suspicious alerts, because we already kind of made a lot of progress using SOAR.
Yes.
So I believe then kind of the agents can help us do that with less effort in terms of implementation. Because SOAR has always had pain points related to the implementation. You have to figure out what's going on. You have to write the playbooks. You have to figure out the integrations. And a lot of SOAR implementations fail because organizations kind of do not navigate that effort in an appropriate manner with all the resources necessary, etc. And I think the agents, because they are more, I say, probably easier to implement, right? They're more malleable. I think you can implement them successfully with less effort. So it'll be like kind of SOAR 2.0. I hate to end up accidentally creating something like SOAR
Next
MG or something
generation
like that. But I
SOAR.
think that yes, right. But you see, kind of there are vendors saying, "Now, SOAR is dead," right? Kind of it is all the famous kind of acronym generation and category generation name, etc. That we know how it works. But the agents, I think, kind of will be successful in the points where we try to use SOAR, but the effort to do it right, to implement it right, was just too much. There are a few things, however, that I think that they may alleviate the load. Just like we were talking about the ingestion side, they're still gonna need a lot of human, either kind of human supervision or even direct human work, right? And it normally kind of points to the place where you are developing new sim content, right? Kind of new rules, for example, right? And many times you need to create rules or define kind of what you're going to analyze with your traditional machine learning based on some threat intelligence. Oh, I am concerned about this threat hitting my environment. And then there's all that thinking process about when this threat hits me, where are they going to interact with in my environment? Which signals will be generated? What do I need to look for on those signals so I can identify that threat? And then also, what type of benign activity in my environment may also be seen, right, kind of by as suspicious or malicious by this logic that I will be implementing. And I think that that entire exercise is still something that is very exclusive to human activity. Of course, there will be steps that can be simplified, like, for example, writing something in common language. Like, I want a rule, I want a model to do this and this and this, and then kind of feed that into an agent, for example, that will write the logic to the specific SIM that I have in my environment, deploy it, and even test it. And then also produce the instructions for the agent downstream about how to assess, right, and how to triage the events that will come out of that logic. I think kind of in that sense, we're going to have a lot of value, additional value on top of SIM deployments coming from the agents that kind of can eventually
Mm.
come out.
So let's pivot a little bit. I want to ask you a question about security data fabrics. There's a lot of noise going on in the space right now, and movement towards this idea of having a security data fabric that sits either, depending on your point of view, in front of the SIM or alongside the SIM. And part of the reasoning I've seen for that is that having this data fabric, it can let you more easily do work with LLMs, because the LLMs and the next gen AI systems can leverage that data without having to put load on your SIM. Do you agree with that kind of approach, or do you think that SIM should be the main integration point for these next generation AI agents?
I think I agree with the idea that you have additional intelligence in the log or the event telemetry collection and then routing activity. Right, where that's going to happen, I think it's another
Mm.
question. I think kind of the data pipeline manager standalone products are coming out and becoming more popular because most SIMs out there lack of that, right, kind of that set of features. So I think it's a natural kind of way that kind of products emerge. When you have something that kind of should have a feature and it doesn't have, right, you end up seeing kind of a someone coming out with a product that will address the need. And I think that's what happened with these DPMs
Mm,
today, right? So you and there is the challenge that has always been around with SIM that is related to kind of when the acronym came out, right? Kind of when we merged the security information management with the security event management, right, into the same thing, you end up kind of converge into very different use cases, although for the same data. One to retain the data for a long time, make it available for reporting, for searches, etc. And then the kind of online real-time detection piece. And right, kind of probably kind of the bulk of the data that you need to ingest for both use cases is the same. But I think what we are learning these days is that the delta between, right, kind of the data that you need for detection and the data that you need sometimes for just compliance reasons to retain is significant. So if you are able to route the data that you do not need for detection in a smart manner, so you won't waste computing resources, you won't kind of waste kind of the human cycles of kind of having to figure out if that data is important or not, or kind of what it may trigger from a false positive point of view on the detection side, you may save, right, a substantial amount of money, right, or sometimes even human resources. So I think kind of the need for DPMs is there. Will it justify a standalone product? I don't know. It is something that is fairly trivial for SIM vendors to implement as a feature for their collection structure. And if that happens, right, kind of will it justify for organizations out there to buy something separate? I have questions about that.
that's a good point. So on AI agents, I've been working with some SOCs worldwide that are rolling out AI agents from scratch. They're experimenting, leveraging OpenAI's APIs or the APIs that are provided by Gemini or AWS to essentially kind of roll their own agents using Python scripting. And they're seeing some success. Some of them are seeing success, some are running into problems. Do you think that organizations should be playing with this today and trying to get value out of it, or do you think this kind of DIY approach is workable? Because the whole thing it reminds me of this motion to roll your own security data lake that was going on in like the early 2010s, that when everyone was pissed off at sim vendors and trying to do it themselves, and we know how that ended up.
Yeah, I was about to bring that up, right? Kind of, oh, it's secure data lakes
Yes.
all over again, right? And I think every time that the tools come out, right, kind of, and the use case, right, kind of for that specific need, on this case, right, kind of the agents, kind of simplifying some of the secure operations needs, it it becomes really attractive for many organizations to go and do things on their own, right? Especially because when you look at the level of maturity of the products in the market, many organizations will look and say, this is still not ready for us, right? And sometimes you look at large enterprises, they say, this is not enterprise ready yet, so we're going to deploy our own. And I think it's, as you said, right, exactly the same path that we went through with the data lakes. And there will be organizations that will be in a good position to do that because they have the skills internally, they have the resources, etc. How many organizations out there are in that position? It's really just a few, right? We are talking about those kind of Fortune 100s, Fortune 50s sometimes, right? And still, will they be successful, right? Kind of, will they implement something that works? I wouldn't be surprised if they do it, right? The problem is, will they be able to keep it in a way that is sustainable from a cost point of view, right? Because the products will keep evolving. Right? The vendors that are kind of really kind of building special purpose agents for cybersecurity, they're going to have, right, kind of entire organization dedicated to it. So of course they're going to have the economy of scale and kind of all the other resources. If you think about the data, for example, for training these things, for fine tuning, if a vendor that kind of is working with multiple organizations have access to that data, the amount of data that they will have to fine tune some of the models behind these agents will be far better than an organization with just their own data set. So there are many situations. Of course, they may be something more specific to their environment that may kind of help them focus or certain use cases or certain specific needs. But when you look at kind of the threat environment, for example, right, kind of the vendor ends up having the better visibility across the entire right kind of threat landscape to gather all the data and do the fine tuning. Think about the anti-malware solutions, for example, right? Kind of you don't see people kind of deploying their own antivirus, right, or creating their own antivirus. And why is that, right? Because the vendors have kind of far more visibility across the threat universe. And I think kind of with the agents will be the same thing. Some organizations will have the necessary human resources, the skills, right, kind of the tools to do it. Will they make sense to keep doing it over a long term? No, I don't think so, right? I think kind of vendors will start kind of getting to a point when their solutions will be mature enough that justify and build that kind of on your own is just gonna be very hard for most organizations out there.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's one of these challenges whenever there's a new emerging space. Do you leap in with both feet first, or do you sit back and wait for somebody else to take all those hits for you?
And there are also organizations that are very do-it-yourself type of culture, right? And I think for them, I wouldn't be surprised that it works, right? Sometimes when you do the math, we look at things and say, well, probably if they had started with an off-the-shelf product and have invested in proper implementation, etc., would be cheaper, right? But it's just part of their culture. They do not want to buy something. They are very comfortable with building things and kind of tweaking, etc. So it is a factor that I think it is outside of the traditional flow that you go kind of to evaluating a product for buying, etc.
Well, Augusto, I think we're up against our time clock here, and I want to thank you again for taking the time to join me here today on the podcast. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you, Jason, again for having me. It was a very fun conversation, and hope we'll be able to do it soon again.
Definitely looking forward to that. This has been the Security Accelerator podcast powered by Symbian. For more information on generative AI for cyber defense, visit us in our Slack community. You can find the link on our website at symbian.ai. Have a topic or guest that you think would be perfect for an upcoming episode? Reach out to me via podcast@symbian.ai. Until next time, stay curious and stay safe.